multiplied by the adjusted marginal cost pupil units. And I just think that's kind of humorous because it does add a set of complexity, but it makes sense when you kind of look at it. For example, kindergartners do not bring the whole $5,124 with them. And that is because they're only considered 0.612 of a student. And that is because traditionally in the past, our kindergarten kids only went half day. But we know more and more, especially for our at-risk kids, that all-day kindergarten is really needed. And many families want it, so almost our schools have to provide it because it's competitively needed and parents want to see it. But if our schools offer it, they don't get full funding for all-day K. And then if you go on, kids in grade 1 through 3 generate a little bit more, 1.115. There was some extra weighting for these, for the grade 1 through 3 in the mid-'80s because there was that real push to for reading for our early learners, and so this was the way they directed funding into that area by weighting the kids more. Apparently, our kids in grades 4 through 6 are most like a student because they are closest to 1, and finally the kids in grades 7 through 12 are rated at 1.3. So the schools get 30% more of that $5,124. For our secondary students, and that's because, traditionally their lab work and their textbooks and all that used to be quite a bit more expensive, and extracurriculars kick in. So there's a whole lot of reasons for it. So although that's somewhat complicated, it makes sense when you walk through it. The one thing that education organizations, schools, and school boards and administrations ask the state at a minimum is to provide inflationary increases. Because if we want the same number of teachers and the same programs and the same extracurriculars at the same cost and the same bus routes, if we want them next year, then we're going to have to see inflationary increases, or we're going to have to cut or find other revenue. So that is what we're always looking for. It's a little bit complicated, but I always feel I need to mention this, and no talk of education funding is complete without touching on the 2001 property tax reform. Prior to 2001, that basic formula was a combination of state aid, which is primarily generated from income tax and sales tax. But it also had a component from our property tax, which was called the general education levy. And I really like the general education levy because if we're going to use property taxes to fund our school, we need that to be fair. And what was good about that general ed levy was that we paid the same regardless of where we lived. It was how you paid into it was based on the property wealth of the entire state, not just your district. So if I lived in a $100,000 home here in Painesville, or in Centennial, or in Minnetonka, or in Minneapolis, I pay the same amount into this general ed levy. If I had a $500,000 home, I'd pay more, but I'd pay the same as everybody else. So that was kind of a fair way, if you want to say, using property taxes. But and the other good piece about that is property taxes tend to be way more stable than your income taxes and your sales tax in tough economic times. So we had this piece of the basic formula that had that stability of property, stable property tax versus the state aid, which bounces all over the place with the economy. But back in 2001, Jesse Ventura, then governor, said if Minnesota is the education state, then Minnesota should pay 100% of the cost to educate our kids. The real motive behind that was property tax relief. People were calling for property tax relief, and this was the way they thought they could do it. So at that time, all of us were paying $1 billion into our schools through our property taxes, and Jesse said the state's going to do that. Well, we all got our Jesse checks, if you remember, and we all got our property taxes were lowered, and that was fine, except for one thing. The legislature passed only the first part of the bill because the what Jesse Ventura and his staff brought to them was a pretty balanced concept. If Minnesota was going to take on $1 billion a year of expenses for our schools, they better find a revenue stream. So he proposed taxing services. We don't currently tax those in Minnesota. So if you got a haircut or cleaned your house or went to an architect, you would pay some sales tax on that, and that would fund this new obligation the state took on. Well, the legislature loved the property tax relief. They did not care for the expansion of sales tax, so they only passed part of it. And they took on that $1 billion expense with one-time surplus dollars that year, and the next year or the year after, we went in rough economic times that were compounded $1 billion by this choice they made. So the overall, what that really did for us in education is it tied all of the education funding from the state to the state economy, and we didn't have that equalizing piece anymore. Okay, in my past, I was an engineer for young, so I am the queen of spreadsheets. But don't let this one scare you, because this is usually when people start getting glazed eyes. But this is a very important slide, so we need to walk through it. And there will be no test, so it's okay. This looks at the last 20 years of how our state has funded that basic formula, the meat and potato funding for our district. So it starts, the first column is the school year, and the second column is what that basic formula was. And as I said, it's $5,124, and you can see that at the bottom of the chart, how long it's been $5,124. And the third column is that general increase. Like I said, we really asked the legislature to provide inflationary increases so we have stability in our programming. And that is a number that, the news will talk about. It's a number that people put in their campaign literature. It's a number that's watched closely. What I have on that fourth column is what I call the perceived percent change, because of what happens in the fifth column. I call that actual roll-in. What a roll-in is when there used to be a category inside that basic formula, the legislature determined, you know what, this is really part of the basic formula, so they took the dollars and they shut that categorical down and they rolled it into the basic formula. So indeed, it looks like the general basic formula went up, but in actuality, it's just shifted. Those dollars were shifted, and they were not new dollars for our school. So you really have to look at what were the new dollars that our schools got to continue their programming. And so that's what I have in the last two columns. So let's take a look at it. Early 90s, lo and behold, tough economic times. The state froze the basic formula for 2 years. Then in 1995, they gave a $100 increase. So that's about a 3% increase. Inflation, according to CPI, tends to run about 3%. So people would say, well, okay, the schools, you can hang tight, you can keep what you got, you're getting inflationary increases, that's good. Well, what really happened that year? Well, you know that general ed levy that they abolished in 2001? Well, they again wanted to give property tax relief that year, so they just took $100 out of what was being collected through the property tax and doled it out to the state. It was just shifted dollars. Our schools didn't get $100 more, they just got $100 from the state instead of the property tax. So really that increase for the third time in the year turned out to be 0%. I think 1996 and 7 is a very interesting year. That year, the formula went up by $300 a kid. Now, I often say, because I do believe, if we ever saw a real $300 increase, a real 8.6% increase, we'd see our board members and superintendents out dancing in the streets. Maybe, maybe yes. Think of the opportunity we could provide for our kids, the holes that we can plug, the more rigor we can add if we had a stream of 8% increase year after year. Well, what really happened that year? Well, there used to be a category called transportation. You know the cost to buy or lease your buses, maintain them, gas in them? The legislature said, well, that getting your kids to and from school is part of the basic ed. They took that category, they shut it down, and they rolled the funding into the basic formula. And then there was this teacher training stuff. It's really kind of nice if our teachers get trained and that they're up on the most current teaching strategies. Well, there was some money set aside in another category, and they shut that one down and they rolled it in. All of that was shifted dollars. The actual increase that year was 0. You can see there's any time that there was any dollar amount in that actual Roman column, that was not good for our schools. It gives the appearance that our schools got money when it was just a shift. I think the 2002, 2003 years when they did the general property tax reform, and it actually increased the formula by $429. That's 11% increase. I still, there's a lot of new legislators this year, so I don't hear it so much. But even last year and the year before, I often heard from legislators say, we gave you $1 billion in 2002, and what did we give for it? Well, they just shifted $1 billion. They didn't give our schools $1 billion. So all of this is very misleading. But then what we have to do is step back and say, well, how have our schools been treated for the last 20 years? So if you take it up and you just average the yearly increases, if you go and see what it was in 1991, it was $3,000 and it's $5,000 now, and you divide that, that's an average increase of 2.9%. Almost 3%, and of course that's what the price index on inflation is. So people say, what's going on in schools? Why are you always complaining about not having enough money? Well, once you really deduct the money that was just a shift, the no new dollars for our schools, if you really look at what the actual increases in funding for our schools have been over the last 20 years, the average is 1.4%. That is less than half of what our schools needed just to keep up with inflation.
Per year.
Per year. So what that means is that for the last 20 years, our schools have already been tightening their belts. And for the last 20 years, our schools have already been cutting the fat. In fact, for the last 20 years, not only have our schools been living within their means, but they have been living within diminishing means. So again, on graph, I told you I was a spreadsheet queen. This is the representation of what the funding would be if it kept up with inflation, that's the top line, and what it is based on what the legislature has done for us. Now look at in the 2000s, that's when that gap really went crazy. And look at it, it's $1,903 per kid. That is a huge number. That is not a little number. But that is how much less buying power our schools have as, from the days of the early 90s. And remember that number, because I'll get back to it. I always like to just throw this up there, because remember, our schools are getting a 1.4% increase, but hey, let's look at actual cost drivers in education. Fuel oil is going up 11% a year. Our schools get 1.5. You know, we live in Minnesota. We got to heat our schools. Gasoline and diesel, we got to provide transportation to our kids. It goes up at 8%. We get 1.24% to handle that. Education books and supplies. It really would be nice if our kids have current technology that we can. You get the feeling. You know, nowhere is there anything less or around 1.4% a year. And healthcare. We know that that's the biggest economic threat, not only at the federal level, our state governments, our home budgets, but it really impacts the entities that are labor intensive. And what is education? Education is all about hiring teachers to teach our kids, and then putting the support staff behind them. 75 to 80% of the cost of education can all be related to labor costs. And when the healthcare portion of that is going up in double digits, and our schools are getting a 1.4% increase to handle it, well, you can kind of figure out what kind of stress that's going to provide. So, if the legislature hasn't wanted to fund our schools, they always want to do something, so they mandate. Here is just some of the current and not so current mandates that our schools are required to do year after year. And we can make an argument if these are the best things in the world or not the best thing in the world for our children. But the point is our schools have had to fund these themselves and make them happen. And if the funding doesn't come with it, I really do think it's irresponsible of our legislature to continue to ask our schools to do more. One of the...
Can you go back to that?
Yeah.
I guess I have to read it. You get through all of it.
Oh.
That's good.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And I always say that the big word is reform down at the legislature right now. And reform is very quickly and easily, without the funding, becomes an unfunded mandate. So I caution the rush to reform if we're not going to be responsible enough to make sure schools can successfully implement reform with the funding and resources they need. An example of one of the larger financial challenge due to unfunded mandates is the Special Education Act. Back in the 70s, the federal government said that our children with special needs would be better served in our schools rather than in their homes or in institutions. So at that time, they sent 1 million children into our schools. Now, I think our schools have done an excellent job helping our special ed kids meet their full potential. The problem is that neither the federal government or the state government have ever provided the funding for the extra services that are mandated for our schools to give the kids. So back in the 70s, the federal government promised to pay 40% of the extra services and the extra costs to educate our special ed kids. They have gotten as high as 24% over the last 2 years because of one-time stimulus dollars. But those are going away now, and it's going back to where it's always been, right around 15%. And then our state kicks in some, but not nearly as much. I mean, here's a representation of that. This is the gap between what it costs to provide the special education services that are required by law and what our schools get to fund those. And as you can see,